Now, moving on to part 3 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stardust Crusaders. When people talk about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, generally, they're going to refer to this series. This is definitely the most well-known part of JoJo's, both in Japan and in other areas of the world, mostly because for quite a while, the West only had exposure to this part, the Capcom fighting game, and if I recall correctly, once JoJo started finally coming over, the only thing that was really translated for the longest time was stuff from Stardust Crusaders. However, this is also probably the most well-known part in Japan as well, mostly because for all intents and purposes, this is where JoJo kind of found its place and started going in a different direction, if you will. Not to say that Japan didn't love parts 1 and 2, but to be completely honest, they're kind of a standard affair for the genre. They did a lot of unique and interesting things, but overall, they're still pretty common for the shonen type manga at the time. A lot of the same tropes and, just overall the same type of journey that you see in a lot of other stuff. So, part 3 is really what made JoJo stick out from the rest. And there's a couple reasons for that. So I'm going to go ahead and say right off the bat that this is probably the first part in JoJo's where I had no issue with the art at all. In fact, the art is quite nice. I really liked it. You can tell that the artist finally has a really good grasp of how to convey what he wants on a page. And honestly, the art just looks really good throughout all of this. No complaints there. Definitely some really great panels in this, especially with some of the bigger fights where you can tell that more time and effort was spent. Really, really phenomenal with that, and I can't wait to read the next parts because I hear it just gets better from here. Now, the story of part 3 goes something like this. So the plot really kicks off when Joseph Joestar, who is the protagonist of part 2, Battle Tendency, flies over to Japan to visit his daughter and his grandson, Jotaro Kujo, who is the new JoJo and new protagonist of this part. However, Joseph soon finds out that Jotaro has imprisoned himself, claiming that he has been possessed by an evil spirit, and that he does not wish to come out until that is dealt with, and he is worried that he is a danger to those close to him because of this evil spirit that he has no clue about. But Joseph and a friend of his from Egypt named Muhammad Avdol, or Abdul, depending on what translation you're going by, convince him to get out, and they tell him that that's no evil spirit. It is actually how do I put this? It is a spirit that is kind of a guardian force. It is a special ability known as a stand because the spirit stands by your side, and yes, I know that name is as dumb as it sounds, especially given the explanation for it. However, stands are quite cool, and they are actually the reason that Part 3 is so well loved by people. However, I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm going to continue explaining the story. So, Joseph and Jotaro get around to talking, and Joseph says, I've recently developed a stand too. Everyone that is a Joestar has. And the reason for this seems to be because Dio, who was the antagonist of Part 1, has resurrected from the bottom of the ocean and has stolen Jonathan Joestar, who is the protagonist of Part 1's body, and is now doing evil vampire things over in Egypt. So, to make everything back to normal and make sure Dio doesn't fuck shit up more because he's fucking Dio, Joseph and Jotaro decide they need to go to Egypt and finally put an end to Dio and all of his evil plans. Now, what I love right off the bat with Stardust Crusaders is that it brings in a lot of stuff from parts 1 and 2, which I wasn't expecting because I've heard so much about Stardust Crusaders, and there are some people that just say, oh, just watch Stardust Crusaders or read Stardust Crusaders and ignore parts 1 and 2, which I have to disagree with after reading this because there's just so many callbacks and so many aspects of the plot that are first introduced in parts 1 and 2. You would not get the same experience as someone who just skipped right ahead to 3. What I really find interesting, too, is that this is the first part where we have a protagonist from an earlier part show up again. So, obviously, in Battle Tendency, Jonathan wasn't around. But, however, Joseph is around for Jotaro in part 3, and he's there to give him some advice and sometimes clash heads because of their differences in personality, which is really interesting. I really like Joseph in this part too because you can tell he's the same character, and he has quite a similar personality, but he is definitely older. This takes place in the 1980s, so definitely a very old Joseph. And he's kind of calmed down a bit. He has quite the temper. He's a racist asshole, which is quite hilarious actually. And you can see that he's a lot wiser, but there's still a lot of aspects from battle tendency that you can see brought over into his character. On the other hand, Jotaro is a very, very calm, cool, and collected character. However, I do want to say that as a protagonist, I did not like Jotaro until fairly late on into the series. For the majority of it, he just seemed kind of boring to me. He seemed like that stereotypical protagonist that's just kind of always very calm and never really freaks out that much. And you're never really worried too much about him because he has everything down. He can think his way out of any situation. And it wasn't really until later on where his character starts to develop a little bit more that I really liked him as a protagonist, which was kind of a bummer for me because with parts 1 and 2, I just immediately loved Jonathan and Joseph as soon as I started reading about them, and they immediately caught my interest, whereas Jotaro took a little bit more time. And speaking again about other stuff that's brought over from part 1 and 2, Dio is back as the main villain, which is awesome because if anyone's listened to my part 1 review, Dio is amazing. He is such a great character. He is literally just an evil asshole, and that is his sole reason for existing. And he's just so evil that you cannot wait for Jotaro to beat the ever-loving shit out of him. And it's the payoff is so great for the final battle of this arc. I love it. Now, one thing I do want to say is that I was pretty interested with this because in parts 1 and 2, the antagonists were pretty present most of the time. In part 1, Dio pretty much was almost always there. Of course, you won a few chapters between battles where he was kind of in hiding for a little bit, but they kept cutting back to him, and we kept checking up on him to see what evil shit he was doing while Jonathan was looking for him. And then once again in part 2, you have the Pillar Men, who aren't necessarily the central focus, but they're constantly in view, and you can constantly see what they're doing and what evil things they're doing. Whereas in part 3, you only see bits and pieces of Dio and what he's doing over in Egypt. And that's a pretty interesting way to do it because I just wasn't used to this series going in that route. It almost felt like Dio was Sauron for a little bit, especially because as JoJo and his party, I guess, make his way over to Egypt, Dio is kind of resting, so he naturally doesn't want to get involved himself. He keeps sending other stand users to go deal with JoJo and friends, and they constantly make references to Dio and how great he is and all this other stuff, and it really creates this very menacing image of Dio, which is interesting too because we've already seen quite a bit of Dio and his flaws and a decent exploration of his character in part 1. So it's really, really amazing how they managed to kind of not rebuild, but improve on and work with his character and the expectations set forth, because they make him seem to be this evil, dark god that is just totally has humanity under his thumb in this. And it's so unique and interesting to see that. One quick thing I want to talk about with Dio, however, and maybe this was just me, but it feels like when we finally do get to Dio and see a bit more of him personally in part 3, it almost feels like he is a separate character from Dio from part 1, and I guess naturally that's to be expected after 100 years stuck at the bottom of the ocean. I'm sure you're going to change as a person, but sometimes it felt a little too disjointed for comfort, but other than that, Dio is still a great villain, and he's still Dio. However, part 3 isn't all about closing threads from part 1 and 2. There's quite a bit of new stuff, most notably the stands. And stands are just so great. Bless Araki for coming up with stands, because they are just such a unique concept. For anyone who has played the Persona series, Personas were very heavily inspired by stands. It is very obvious. But stands are just great because they start off a pretty basic concept. You have pretty humanoid looking figures that maybe they can punch really fast, or they're really accurate, or they can expand really far and shrink, or they have fire attacks, or they can breathe fire, stuff like that. It's pretty basic, average stuff to grasp. But as the series goes on, you get some really, really weird shit. Like, there's one stand that is just an entire ship, like an actual ship in the ocean. There's another stand that is a cursed sword that will brainwash whoever unsheaths it. Really cool stuff, really original stuff, and I really like it, especially the stand rules, which they kind of play with. Most notably, if a stand gets damaged, the user will get damaged. So if I chop off your stand's hand, the person that was controlling the stand will also have their hand chopped off in return. This leads to some really interesting and unique battles from other stuff I've seen. Just overall a lot of fun, especially when they play with the rules of stands and how they work. It never really feels like they're breaking them like a lot of other manga and anime series tend to do when they mess around and play with the rules of the universe and how they work. It really just feels natural. It doesn't feel at any point where it's just bullshit. And for some of the more surprising stands, the characters themselves will say, "I don't know how the fuck I'm supposed to deal with this. This is bullshit." So that's a lot of awesome stuff right there. Just really well written, really well thought out. Man, I really wonder if Araki came up with all these stands on his own, because they're just so creative. It's amazing, and there are so many of them. That's another thing I want to point out. This is, if I recall correctly, this is the longest part. And sure, there are some points where it kind of drags in some places, and that was probably the issue I had with this the most. Was there are some really boring parts of this that just kind of last a little bit too long for comfort. But overall, I didn't mind the length, because I wanted to see the next stand user. I really just wanted to see what the next stand would be and how they would deal with it. Sadly, sometimes there are not that great of stand users that are just kind of dumb and boring to read about, but overall most of them are really good, and I loved watching these encounters and how they played out. I've basically said all I really want for the review, but there is one more thing I kind of want to touch on, and that is, you can kind of feel that as JoJo's went on, that got more popular, and I'm sure that a lot more people got involved with the publishing and writing process for this. Now, there are numerous times in this where I can feel Araki being pressured by higher-ups or fans or what have you to change aspects of the story. Now, early on, you can kind of see this, and apparently this is actually confirmed. I think this has been confirmed that higher-ups wanted the Part 3 protagonist to be at least part Japanese. Now, the reason for this is that in Japan, apparently I'm not entirely sure how true this is, but apparently Japanese readers want to read more so about Japanese protagonists, whereas Part 1 and 2, you had an English and an American protagonist, respectively. And you can kind of see Araki giving them the finger, because he brings up maybe once or twice that he's Japanese, and then they never bring it up again. So that's pretty funny. And also, from what I hear too, there was just an overall push to make JoJo's Bizarre Adventure a more Japan-oriented series, which Araki pretty much told them to fuck off with too, because first few chapters are set in Japan, and the rest is just traveling to Egypt, and then finally Egypt itself. So I really respect Araki for that, for saying, you know what, I don't feel like writing a story about that, and that's not my vision, so I'm going to give you a little bit of what you want, but not really. Another point where you can see this is a character leaves the story for a while. I'm not going to spoil why, but the character is effectively gone from the story for a bit, and there's a lot of fan pressure to bring this character back. So he does, but then a few chapters later, maybe a few volumes, I can't remember quite how long the distance is, the character leaves again. He's gone from the plot once more. So you can kind of, again, feel Araki saying, Yeah, I'll give you a little bit, but not really. I'm still going to make this my story. I don't want you to have too much influence, which is really cool because there's a lot of people that can't resist that type of pressure, and they will give in and negatively impact the story that way because they're writing something that isn't their own anymore. But Araki says, "Fuck that! I'm writing JoJo's, and JoJo is mine." So good on him for that. Overall, Stardust Crusaders, great read. Uh, like I said earlier, sometimes it kind of drags through and it's kind of boring in some parts, whereas part one and two kept me thoroughly entertained pretty much all the way through the ride. I will say that I do think I like Battle Tendency a bit more, but this is pretty damn good. This is close behind. I'm gonna say it's a 9 out of 10. Please read parts 1 and 2 before this. Some people disagree with me on that, but it won't be the same experience and it won't be as enjoyable in my opinion if you don't have some of the background info provided from parts 1 and 2. So yeah, this is amazing. I'm already started on part 4, so stay tuned for that review.